middle of the South China Sea, a rusting ship is beached on a reef. Its crew of Marines nervously wait for their supply ship to bring them food and water, but the supply ship never arrives. The supply ship, the Unaisa, was intercepted by hostile vessels, separated from its escort ship, and almost destroyed by high-pressure water cannons, which annihilate the bridge and injure the crew. This rusting ship, and the Marines which guard it, are allies of the United States, and the US is legally bound to support them if they are attacked. After months of an intensifying blockade on the ship, the US will soon be forced between defending its ally and risking conflict with China, or turning a blind eye and appearing untrustworthy to regional powers. This is the story of how a rusting ship in the Spratly Islands, the Sierra Madre, is dragging the US into a showdown with China. But before looking more at this makeshift marine outpost, we must answer one glaring question. Why is China risking everything over these innocuous reefs? Ask a member of the Chinese Politburo this question, and you will get one simple answer. We will fight for these islands because they are ours, and have been since the Han Dynasty ruled China in the 1st century AD. But behind this historical claim lays something far more important: trade routes. This is a visualization of all cargo ships in the South China Sea. The traffic passing through here accounts for 60% of global maritime trade, and most of it is traveling to or from a Chinese port. For China, these shipping lanes are the lifeblood of its economy. Outbound traffic exports Chinese goods to the rest of the world, and inbound traffic imports the massive quantities of natural resources which China requires to keep its economy running. From the perspective of Chinese decision makers, allowing these shipping lanes to remain out of reach of the People's Liberation Army Navy is to leave their future in the hands of their adversaries. To prevent this, they have developed what Western analysts call the String of Pearls, a series of naval facilities along these sea lanes stretching from China to the major African seaport in Port Sudan. In countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, these ports were accessed through financial means. But the South China Sea presented a unique case for China. In the midst of the deep sea, a series of reefs and sandbanks appear, the Spratly Islands. Or, as China probably calls them, free real estate. With the Spratlys being claimed by 5 other countries, China moved quickly to turn 3 of these reefs into a string of naval and air bases at the heart of the world's busiest trade route. By 2013, hundreds of vessels were pumping sand onto these reefs before covering them with thick layers of concrete. Engineers then turned these man-made islands into some of the military installations we now hear about in the news: Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, and Fiery Cross. All 3 of these bases have runways long enough to support Chinese H-6 bombers and have hardened facilities to increase their survivability against a hostile missile strike. It is here where the Sierra Madre enters the scene. In order to complicate China's growing control over reefs, which are just 100 miles from their mainland, the government of the Philippines ordered their navy to beach a ship on one of the shoals. The Sierra Madre, which served in the US Navy during the Second World War, was beached on the 2nd Thomas Shoal and garrisoned with Marines. Since 1999, resupplying the ship has been challenging. Initially, the Chinese Coast Guard would shadow vessels around the shoal, but was generally permissive of small fishing boats exchanging goods with the Sierra Madre. By 2014, this attitude had changed and supply ships were being turned away, forcing the beached ship to be resupplied by air. While this was sufficient to keep the garrison fed, the ship was badly corroding and sizable holes were appearing across the hull. While the ship could not be sunk, it was at risk of becoming uninhabitable and was in need of more repair materials than could be supplied by the Coast Guard's BN-2 aircraft. This saw the return to naval resupply missions and takes us to the dilemma we currently face today. The Philippines organizes a resupply mission and tasks the Philippine Coast Guard with escorting the supply ships to the Sierra Madre. The Chinese Coast Guard intercept these ships and use ramming, water cannons, and laser dazzlers to force the ships to turn back. While these tactics were used as far back as 2014, it is the rate at which these incidents are occurring which risks dragging the United States into the fold. In 1 month alone, the Unaisa was damaged by water cannons, sent back to base for repairs, and then put out of action a 2nd time, after again coming under fire from a water cannon. For all intents and purposes, the Chinese Coast Guard has the Sierra Madre under a blockade, and with the 80-year-old ship on its last legs, a plan is needed fast. To see what the US can do to support its ally, we need to look back a few years. In May 2022, a ship operated by the Malaysian energy giant Petronas, the West Capella, was conducting exploration activities in an area of the South China Sea claimed by China. The West Capella soon found itself being tailed by ships of the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia. After several weeks of being pursued, the US Navy was tasked with putting an end to the incident using a show of strength. 2 Independence-class littoral ships were moved close to the West Capella, and within days the Chinese vessels received orders to stop their pursuit and return to port. So, if the US already has the blueprint to resolving these types of scenarios, there is one obvious question. Why hasn't the US Navy been tasked with deterring Chinese ships during resupply missions? The answer is likely rooted in one small detail in the West Capella incident. It occurred not in the Spratly Islands, but in James Shoal, the most southerly extreme of the territory China claims, 1,000 miles away from their mainland and just 50 miles from the Malaysian coast. Unlike the Spratly Islands, the reefs here are far below sea level and cannot be adapted into artificial islands, nor would it be feasible given the proximity of Malaysia. When China was faced with the US Navy, the calculus was simple. Is it worth escalating tensions with the US over a landless patch of distant water? Probably not. However, in the Spratly Islands, the question would be very different. The reefs there are not landless, they are strategic air bases which help protect China's most vulnerable flank, and the Sierra Madre is just 20 miles from the most advanced of these bases. Avoiding a confrontation with the US Navy and allowing the Philippines to complete extensive improvements on its outpost does not just prolong their stay, but also introduces actual military vulnerabilities, with defense commentators suggesting that the Sierra Madre should become a signals intelligence platform, vacuuming up any Chinese electrical emissions so that they may be analyzed by Allied forces. It is these high stakes which causes the US to hesitate. On the one hand, the United States has complained that many countries in the region have been fence-sitting, with countries avoiding picking sides until it is clear who will rule the roost in the region. By failing to support the Philippines, with which it has a defense treaty, the US is complicating its own mission of bringing more nations on side. On the other hand, the effort to militarize the Spratly Islands signals its importance to China. After a decade of work and 3 military bases, the Sierra Madre is now in China's backyard, even if international courts disagree. The response of the Chinese Navy to American vessels could therefore be far more hostile and assertive than seen in the past. As with any case involving national security, every action is weighed against its risks, and whilst the US Navy has previously operated in the Spratly Islands, it seems like the current assessment is that the risks associated with assisting the Philippines in their resupply missions outweigh the benefits. Perhaps to be expected in an election year. In any event, if the situation dramatically changes, you can be sure to find updates and other analysis here. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe, and I thank you for watching. This has been Red 4, goodbye.